Hey everyone, welcome to Popular Education, hosted by me, Dominic Black, and my buddy Jordan Wright. This, but there is a potential we could go overtime. We never promise our time, we shoot for about an hour and a half. But seeing as how we're using a different format that we got from viewer recommendations, we'll see how it goes. Could end up a bit shorter than we planned too.
Mhm.
So, without further ado, welcome to Anarcho-Syndicalism Part 2. Last episode, we discussed the theories and praxis of anarcho-syndicalism. Anytime someone talks about anarcho-syndicalism, it's pretty much shameful not to talk about the Spanish CNT and their revolution. I need to say that this isn't a happy ending story, but it is a story of hope, defiance, and struggle. In this episode, we're going to talk about the revolution, and if you don't know by now, it was the absolute messiest event in Spanish history, in anarchist history as well. It was fought by a huge variety of factions and factions and sub factions within those. There's a lot going on, and they were all based on ideals and beliefs about the future of Spain. It's a chronological mess, and so we'll be jumping back and forth, covering them by faction and ideals, not by the actual timeline. So, if you have trouble keeping up, you can stop at any time and, give put your hand up, and we'll stop and make sure you're caught up. Everybody ready? So, the end of an era. If it'll load, there we go. At the beginning of the 20th century, Spain's government was a constitutional monarchy in name, but its interests were dominated by landowners, industrialists, and the Spanish church and the military. Elections were rigged through a system called caquismo, which excluded workers and peasants entirely. Only the rich and people with land got to vote, meaning that democracy only existed for a few elites.
I'll clarify. It's pronounced caciquismo.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So, the come on, there we go. Sorry about that. Spain's agrarian peasant economy lagged behind the rest of Europe. They had vast estates called latifundia, I think. I don't know. I'm trying. And it kept peasants landless and starving while the Industrial Revolution hit Catalonia as it has Britain, which was really freaking hard. When workers organized or initiated strikes, the government responded with the Guardia Civil to break strikes by force. They usually jailed union leaders, tortured them, or executed them. Either three could happen. Employers made things worse through the pistoleros, professional hitmen used to assassinate union militants, especially from the CNT. This turned labor conflict into open urban warfare, and organizers were gunned down in the streets. Unions responded with armed self defense. The CNT won major gains after the 1919 La Canadenza strike in Barcelona, and employers responded by unleashing the pistoleros on the Union. Seeing comrades jailed, tortured, and shot in the street, while the state legalized the violence, a young organizer named Buenaventura Durruti concluded that legal organizing meant waiting to be killed, and in response he formed the Los Solidarios. Born to a working class family, Durruti was trained as a mechanic and entered politics through the labor struggle. He was never a theorist or a writer, and he started out with the socialist UGT before he moved towards anarchism. He did it because he encountered strike breaking, police violence, and employer repression, and was there at the La Canadenza strike. Together, Garcia Oliver, Francisco Ascaso, and Buenaventura Durruti would come together and form Los Solidarios later. Okay. So, in September 20th, 1923, General Miguel Primo de Rivera launched a military coup, claiming that Spain was collapsing into chaos due to the labor unrest. And, Alfonso didn't resist, King Alfonso XIII. Instead, he endorsed Rivera's coup and appointed him as the head of the state. Parliament was suspended and the constitution was shelved. Spain was placed under a military dictatorship. Oof. And de Rivera dissolved electoral institutions. He imposed a censorship and banned the CNT, ruled by decree through a council of generals he called a directory. The coup had overwhelming support from industrialist landowners and much of the middle class, and they saw dictatorship as preferable to the workers' power. The Guardia Civil, urban police, and military courts targeted Los Solidarios and the CNT and other anarchists through surveillance, raids, informants, and indefinite incarceration. Once the CNT was banned, militants lost their legal cover, safe meeting spaces, and mass support. Okay. Jordan, we messed part of this up.
What did we mess up, Dom?
Los Solidarios doesn't come into the story until 27.
Oh, well. Human foibles. Let's read it now. It's still important information.
Well, I go over all of it in a minute. So, we're going to, So, the FAI was formed between Durruti and Ascaso and Garcia. Durruti was in exile during this time and wasn't able to help with a whole lot. He was running between Spain and France, trying to keep from being arrested for his time fighting the Pistoleros. In 1927, amid fears that the CNT might start moderating in order to toe the legal line, militants all over Spain and Portugal gathered in Valencia and founded the Iberian Anarchist Federation. Oliver and Ascaso were definitely there. It's debatable how much of a role they played, but most accounts point towards them being extremely important. Now, it's a common accusation from communists that the FAI was a vanguard, and this wasn't true. They were made up of affinity groups, not vanguard parties, and there is a difference. Affinity groups are autonomous and they don't answer to a party. They aren't intended to lead, and they're basically a group of good friends who come together to create and trust each other. And they come together and they do direct action. They organize protests and stuff together. They're not there to lead. They're not there to influence the organization. The FAI members held dual membership with the CNT, and they influenced it by pushing back when the moderates wanted to take an action that would break with the revolutionary goals of the CNT. Vanguardism isn't exclusive to Marxist Leninism, but the anarchist vanguards were not, the FAI weren't one of them. So, the CNT is an anarcho-syndicalist union formed in 1910 by a Congress of Anarchists in Spain. Any working class person could join, and it was formed from the lowest level upwards through various industrial unions and workers' congresses up to the CNT Federation. At its peak, it represented literally hundreds of thousands of Spanish workers, and not all of them were actually anarchists, but all of them were doing it in practice. On the other hand, the FAI was founded in 1927 through a congress in Valencia involving Juan Garcia Oliver and Francisco Escaso. The Los Solidarios had been broken by the repression of Miguel I messed that name up, didn't I? Miguel Primo de Rivera, and so they'd formed their own affinity group and kept right on. Then they connected with other affinity groups all over Spain and Portugal, and they formed the FAI. They were worried about the presence of moderates in the CNT, and that's why they bound themselves to the CNT through dual membership. And despite the CNT being an anarcho-syndicalist organization, the FAI was actually an anarcho-communist one. And it was also pretty insurrectionary too. They were usually behind the uprisings in Spain. So the CNT didn't order the FAI, and the FAI didn't order around the CNT. The FAI preferred to defer to CNT decisions. Now, Miguel Primo de Rivera was failing to solve any of Spain's problems. He'd lost the support of the military, and the Great Depression was crippling the economy. That fed the labor movement and more social unrest, and neither of which could be controlled. On January 26, 1930, in a desperate attempt to bypass King Alfonso XIII, Primo de Rivera sent a telegram to Spain's military leadership. And it was the most insecure message ever. He asked if they still had their support. And the overwhelming response was pretty much, whatever the king thinks is best. His power base at that point pretty much dissolved, and 2 days later, the king withdrew his support for Rivera, and it forced his resignation and the dissolution of his dictatorship. The army was polarized, and under the dictatorship, promotions had been reported based on loyalty and colonial service, not seniority. Some officers were monarchists loyal to the King Alfonso XIII. Others were conservative Catholics hostile to secular reform. A minority were even Republicans. You hear the word Republican and you probably think that it's more like MAGA and the GOP today, but they're just using the name. A Republican is someone who believes in a government of many rather than a king or a parliament, or, well, they wanted a parliament, but they didn't want a king. In the meantime, while Rivera's dictatorship fell, there were strikes, land occupations, and uprisings happening all over Spain. And this freaked out the military just as much. One of those, you'll come to know, was Francisco Franco, known at the time for his brutal suppression in Morocco. With the dictatorship gone, Alfonso tried to restore the constitution without dismantling the monarchy. And I know I'm going to butcher his name, but he appointed a general named Damaso Berenguer to head what became known as the Dicta Blanda.
Tom, you there?
Oh, that's nice. I muted myself.
Oh.
With the dictatorship gone, Alfonso tried to restore the constitution without dismantling the monarchy, and he appointed General Damaso Berenguer to head what became known as the Dicta Blanda, a softer form of dictatorship meant to transition Spain back to parliamentary rule. But by this point, Alfonso and the monarchy were hated and a humiliating joke to most of Spain. Instead, the Spanish government scheduled city elections all over the country for April 12th, 1931. The elections were held under the Bourbon Restoration system, and the core of that was called Turno Pacifico, or Peaceful Turn. This ought to sound familiar to a few of you. Basically, two dynastic parties took turns in power, conservatives and liberals. The liberals would push for progress and reform when they were in power, and the conservatives would then turn around and walk it back. Once the king appointed a new prime minister, the government would hold elections to create the parliamentary majority it needed to win. So basically, they would have the election first and then ask everybody to vote. Unfortunately for the king, Caciquismo did not have the power it did in 1927. So the urban voters actually cast their ballots freely for the first time in their lifetimes. Without any formal declaration, Spain simply just stopped listening to the king. His legitimacy had been completely stripped from him. Oops.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah? Is this where we're at? Okay. Per the pact of, oh, okay. Where? Wow. I forgot to change the slides, didn't I?
Did you get muted again?
I'm punching myself in the face because I forgot to change the slides the whole time.
Do you want me to take over on the script so you can get the slides and stuff?
Yeah.
You look like you've got a lot of controls to manage here.
Yes, please do.
Where are we? Are we at I see. We're at when people woke up. Yeah. Well, that's where I'll start. So, when people woke up and checked the election on April 13th, the monarchists had technically won in raw numbers. But because the Republican and Socialist coalitions in the major cities had newspapers, union professional associations, and mass demonstrations, they'd won overwhelmingly through visible support rather than numbers. Per the Pact of San Sebastian in 1930, if the monarchy dissolved or failed in any way, a revolutionary committee of Republicans, regionalists, and socialists was to take power. And so this committee declared itself the provincial government of the Second Spanish Republic. On that committee were some of the antagonists of our tale, the PSOE and the UGT. And they changed their flag and added that fun purple color. I don't know what it represented. The Spanish Socialist Workers' Party was formed on May 2nd, 1879, in Madrid, led by Pablo Iglesias Posse. He also founded the General Workers' Union in Mataró in Barcelona on August 12th of 1888. The PSOE reformist and believed that socialism would be achieved through election coalitions. They were such reformist socialists that they acted private property. They wanted a mixed economy similar to what you see in Scandinavia. Their main priorities were labor protections, secularizing education, and land reform, and they wanted to expand civil rights too. They saw the Republic as a tool they could use to advance Spain. And I don't want to presume that everyone knows what reformism is, so briefly, it's basically the idea that you can reform the current system instead of building a new one. I'm sure there's a better definition, but that'll do for now. The General Workers' Union was closely aligned with them, and they're electoral reformists. They wanted to use collective bargaining through labor advocates to negotiate with bosses. Employees didn't have a say in what these representatives actually negotiated, which will sound very familiar to many people in current long-standing union nurses. The little baby republic tried to get to work, and to their credit, they did stuff. They wrote a constitution which had no official state religion, removed religious influence from schools, seized and sold chunks of church property, and legalized divorce. After investigations, arguments about compensation, and court challenges, the republic began seizing land from absent landlords and giving that land to peasants. But by 1933, they'd only redistributed a fraction of the land they'd promised the peasants. Funding, bureaucracy, and legal challenges from landlords hindered reform, and it caused even more tension. Anarchists became restless and impatient with the slow reforms. And so, in January of 1933, uprisings broke out all over Spain, with the support of Juan Olivier and the FAI, acting autonomously of the CNT, who'd elected not to support the uprisings. They wanted to prevent the consolidation of the bourgeois republic. In the village of Casas Viejas in Andalusia, in the Cadiz province of southern Spain, the people seized the town hall and clashed with the civil guards. The Republic responded the only way a government is capable, through repression. And a brief, very vague fact about Spain is that Spain is made up of many specific regions that don't necessarily have, especially when Spain was turned into Spain at some point, they didn't really have much to do with one another and still have many differences, including specific language differences. It's a very complicated part of Europe. So, after a firefight, security forces surrounded the hut of an elderly anarchist known as Seis Dedos and set it on fire, killing him and several members of his family. Afterwards, around 20 villagers were executed without trial. The event emboldened the anarchists, legitimized their arguments further, and would permanently stain the relationship between the Republic and the CNT-FAI. It also had other effects, though. The Spanish right wing noticed the violence and land seizures, and with the Republic's mounting failures, the right began to become hysterical. New factions would start rising that would reject democracy altogether. I need to go off on a quick tangent to say that fascism isn't always identical. Actually, the fewer fascist traits you can embody while still being fascist tends to correlate to how stable your regime is. Hitler and Mussolini embodied all 14 traits, but were wildly unstable regimes. National socialist and fascist politics were not a major part of the Spanish Civil War. Instead, they would be absorbed by Franco later in the war. And I personally haven't heard before of the 14 traits of fascism, but I'm sure a quick Google will look those up. That sounds fascinating. The committees of the National Syndicalist Offensive, JONS, or Juntas de Ofensiva Nacional Sindicalista, for short, was founded in 1931 by Ramiro Ledesma Ramos and Onesimo Redondo. Ledesma was a philosopher and writer who was influenced by Mussolini's fascism. Redondo was an agrarian conservative and Castilian nationalist. In 1931, they merged their groups into JONS and adopted syndicalist rhetoric because Ledesma believed that fascism had to compete on the field of labor against the CNT in Spain. He defined national syndicalism as the rejection of liberal parliamentarism, Marxist class struggle, and anarchist federalism. It proposed national syndicates that would include workers, technicians, and owners within each sector of production under the authority of a single party state. Dissent would be abolished in the name of national unity, and social life would be reorganized around it. Let's be clear, that the national syndicalist idea was a gimmick. They were not syndicalists who believed in workers' rights, union power, or even mild reform. They wanted to dupe workers into piping down so that they wouldn't have a revolution or dissent against the state. I keep running into things that sound super familiar. Falangist Española. The Falangists were a political party in Spain, founded in 1933 by Miguel's son, Jose Antonio Primo de Rivera. Like John's, the organization rejected liberalism, democracy, pluralism, and Marxist class struggle in favor of a unified nation led by a single party. However, unlike John's, which was a trade union structure of fascism built to face down the labor movement, the Falangists were an explicitly Mussolini-styled political party and organized nearly identically. Party hierarchy emphasized charismatic leadership, indoctrinated youth through universities and camps, cultivated a cult of violence, and called for an authoritarian nationalist government. Their militias wore blue shirt uniforms and attacked leftists in the streets, usually trying to assassinate or otherwise kill them. Rhetorically and aesthetically, they were palette swapped, but identical to fascismo. Before we continue, does anyone have any questions? I know we've gone through a lot. This is a very dense topic. Oh, and thank you, Zolant, for posting the essay that came up with the 14 traits in the chat. I'll definitely check that out.
Yes, absolutely every single person should read Umberto Eco's essay.
It's also fascinating that you've noted that there's a correlation between how few of them you follow and how stable your situation is. I can't wait to think more about that. Well,
I would recommend.
Oh,
Sorry, I was just going to say, if you're interested in that, I would recommend looking into Antonio Salazar.
That's a name I've heard. Okay, well, let's continue. I'm just going to put that in my thing so I don't forget. Okay. Prelude to War.
Hang on, we got a question. Were the
Oh, we do?
Yes, were the fascists influenced by the Bolsheviks with the one-party dictatorship united by nationalism? The answer is not really. The Bolsheviks had different mechanisms and different... The fascists were more of a response to Bolsheviks than influenced by them or inspired by them. The Bolsheviks believed that their one-party state would be a bunch of workers who would eventually dissolve that state. The fascists were like, let's just not dissolve the state and ramp up our capitalism instead.
I also always try to remember that in this period of time, although more so in the 1900s than in 1930, but still, then nationalism itself was a fairly new concept. It would have been considered an approach to thinking about nation states rather than just sort of the standard way that people go about running a nation, just beginning to be more common these days. Anyway, ready? Okay. CNT. After the Casas Viejas massacre, anarchists shifted away from spontaneous and disconnected uprisings towards workplace organizing on a mass scale, preparing to defend themselves in a war. By 1935, Durruti didn't trust the Republic. He was hostile to reformism and began to advocate for discipline, coordination, and readiness. Anarchists rebuilt their unions, which were usually federated through the CNT. More pacifist anarchists built their unions' logistics, capacity, militant ones organized workplace committees, prepared their unions for strikes, and built networks to maintain strikes like strike funds and other mutual aid that'd hold up during an emergency. The Spanish Republic. In 1935, the Spanish Republic couldn't get anything done. Panicking conservatives had paralyzed the Republic and ignored it in favor of their nationalist coalitions. The nationalist factions began rolling back reforms, stalling land expropriations, and relied on the military to crush any unrest. Corruption scandals discredited institutions in the Republic, and its repression against the labor movement had turned the revolutionary movement against them. The Communist International encouraged cooperation between anti-fascist blocs in Spain to defend democracy, liberty, trade unions, and constitutional government from reactionary forces. In 1935, liberals, republicans, socialists, communists, the PSOE, the Izquierda Republicana, and the Republican Union, even the PCE, though smaller at the time, gathered together in response to the Comintern's directives and formed the Spanish Popular Front inside of the Republic. There were a lot of acronyms in that sentence. That's one of the problems with the Spanish Civil War. They were electoral, agreed on a shared platform, and preserved the independence of everyone involved for a time. The fascists. Numerically, they were small in 1935, but they were incredibly violent. Throughout 1935, they expanded their militant activity into organized street leftist organizations like PSOE and the CNT-FAI. They were in a frenzy and believed that Spain was on the brink of communist collapse. In the process, they were normalizing violence, training shock troops, and acting as a bridge to conservative fascism. Francisco Franco. Franco had spent his time since 1930 building his reputation as a loyal and ruthless military officer that brought law and order. He and other officers began planning a military coup in 1935. In 1936, the Popular Front won the national elections in Spain. The new government began working towards reform again, resumed their legalistic land expropriation, and released loads of political prisoners. For conservative landowners and military officers, this was a sign that the Republic was moving left instead of collapsing, and somehow, this was even worse to them. The Republic had sent Franco to the Canary Islands to keep him from any conflicts. But by spring 1936, Franco joined a conspiracy to commit a military coup in Spain alongside Emilio Mola and José Sanjurjo. The uprising began in Morocco, where Franco had already ruled with an iron fist during his deployments there through the 1920s. Officers there were already aligned with Franco and moved to seize control of the local government and the communications network. By the night of July 17, 1936, Francisco Franco had openly begun his rebellion. Franco's strongest units were in Morocco, including the Army of Africa, the most effective fighting force available to the rebels. After negotiations and meetings with Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini, Franco secured air transports from the Nazis and fascists and carried out one of the first major air transports of troops in history. When news of Franco's uprising reached Barcelona on July 18th, the CNT-FAI demanded weapons from the Republic. The Republic hesitated because they feared open revolution more than Franco. In response, the CNT-FAI raided barracks and gun factories, seizing arms the next day. Fighting between the CNT-FAI and Francoist forces began. The anarchists came head to head, and the CNT was winning. Anarchist morale during the first weeks of the war was incredible, infectious, even according to most accounts. Workers reorganized their factories under CNT principles. It's said that the anarchist fighters would prepare their lunches like they were going to work, hug and kiss their partners, march off to the front, which was sometimes only a block away from their houses, and return in time for dinner with their families. There were gatherings of tens of thousands of people who came together to sing "A las barricadas," which meant "to the barricades." You can actually still find old recordings of this on YouTube. Madrid remained loyal to the Republic and was Spain's capital. The uprising there would last months. Meanwhile, Francoist rebels seized Seville, Zaragoza, and Burgos. For the anarchists, relations with the Republic continued to get worse, and worse, to the point that it was fracturing even the Marxist groups. The Workers' Party of Marxist Unification would be the most famous and controversial of these to join the anarchists' side of the split. Whom was formed in 1935 by Andrew Nin, who had become a Marxist after transitioning from anarchism with the CNT-FAI. With him was Joaquin Morin, and peasants' bloc, who'd split from other communist federations. It was a division that ensured they didn't join the Republic. They also believed the Civil War was a part of the social revolution, aligning them with the CNT-FAI. And at times they fought in adjacent trenches during the early years of the war. A common accusation by Leninists and Stalinists against whom is that they were Trotskyists, that were part of his Fourth International. This was not true. They were actually orthodox Marxists, with some Leninism shoved in, but they weren't a Trotskyist, Stalinist, or Leninist organization that disagreed with the more popular Stalinist-led factions of their time. Speaking of which, the PCE, or Communist Party of Spain, was formed in 1921 after a split in the PSOE regarding Stalin's Communist International. They were given arms and supplies as well as air support from the Soviet Union. Due to Stalin's recommendations, they wanted to postpone all revolution to centralize military discipline and build ties with the liberal middle class in the face of fascism. The PCE openly embraced centralization and hierarchy as part of their program, and worse, by 1937, the PCE was openly hostile to the CNT, FAI, and BOOM. Much drama. The Falangist leader, Jose Antonio de Rivera, was arrested by the Republic in March, and this helped push them closer to Franco. Because of Franco's consolidations, mergers, and alliances, the nationalist zones were stabilizing, while the Republican zones were destabilizing. Falangists acted as political police, fascist propagandists, and pushed for a one-party government under Franco. The CNT responded across Spain. In Catalonia and Aragon, a web of militias called columns formed out of the unions, neighborhoods, defense councils, and affinity groups of the CNT-FAI and other anarchists. Quick reminder that the CNT and FAI weren't the only anarchist factions, but the CNT and FAI are the two with the most impact throughout the war. Durruti had become a symbol of the anarchist labor movement, having fought the pistoleros, endured exile, and repeatedly faced imprisonment without giving an inch on his revolutionary attitude. When the columns began forming, he formed his own Durruti column, and inside the anarchist columns, officers like Durruti were elected to lead and could be replaced at any time by their comrades. Pay differentials between ranks were abolished. Major decisions were discussed and voted on collectively in each column, and discipline relied on political commitment and accountability to comrades, not fear of hanging for desertion. There's also a pretty good band called the Durruti Column. If you want to look them up, I don't know much about their politics, but
I knew you were going to mention them.
yeah, I knew about them before I knew that it was a thing, and I learned about it and thought, oh shit, it's a reference. Women, as well as people who were gay and trans, could join the CNT-FAI militias and fight. The war effort was prioritized over their liberation. Your gender and sexuality weren't persecuted or prosecuted under FAI control, but it wasn't all sunshine and roses either. And while most of the anarchists of the CNT supported free love, as it was called, others were still more conservative-minded and preferred traditional gender roles. But this wasn't the majority at the time. All that said, the nationalists would still throw you. All that said, the nationalists would still throw you in a prison for most of your life, So I'll stick my neck out and say the alternatives were worse. Groups like Mujeres Libres, Free Women of the CNT, pushed for full participation in combat and social revolution. Women could vote in CNT assemblies and take on any responsibility they chose for themselves. Gotta love a picture of a bunch of women with guns. It's just exciting. Durruti Column's first major decision was to leave Barcelona for Aragon, so they could advance on Zaragoza, which had been under Francoist control. Durruti put out a call for fighters to join him, and literally thousands volunteered. In July and August, the need for survival was the priority for anti-fascist forces in Spain, and so the CNT-FAI, PUM, PSOE, UGT, and the PCE were all fighting the same fight against Falangists, National Syndicalists, monarchists, and conservatives. By September, as the war began to fall into a sort of flow, the question of priorities opened up a bit. Should the struggle focus on the revolution or the war against fascism? The CNT, FAI, and PUM all argued that the revolution was inseparable from the war effort. Each time the anti-fascist forces liberated a city or village, it began to collectivize, socialize, and undergo radical changes without being pushed too hard. The PCE, whose influence had grown at a ridiculous rate due to the victories of the Popular Front and Stalin's support, started militarizing and suppressing any revolutionary action that Stalin and the Soviet Union deemed premature. The PCE argued that victory against the fascists meant they needed a centralized state authority with a regularized army that would reassure the liberal Republicans that there wouldn't be a revolution. The PCE especially had it out for PUM. Without any evidence, they accused PUM of being politically unreliable. PUM was part of the Republic and against Stalinism. It had massive influence, as well as alignment with the CNT-FAI anarchists. Basically, PUM threatened the influence and power of the PCE, and so the PCE and Soviet Union wanted them gone. While the Republic was developing its abusive relationship with PUM and the CNT, Franco formed an alliance with Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler. What a cursed photo. To get his best troops from Morocco into Spain in July. It was one of the first large-scale troop air transports ever performed. By August, Franco's Army of Africa landed in Andalusia, and their death march towards Madrid began. Franco's forces advanced northward through southwestern Spain in a brutal campaign where cities like Badajoz fell after weeks of fighting and mass executions, followed immediately after their victory. This was a pattern Franco would keep following throughout the war. The Siege of Madrid. In September, Franco had a big decision to make. He could either push directly towards Madrid and catch the Republic off balance, or he could divert his troops to relieve the siege of Alcazar in Toledo and pick up reinforcements in his detour, building his reputation in the process. He chose to divert. His efforts paid off. On October 1st, 1936, Francisco Franco was proclaimed a military general and head of the state by the Nationalist Coalition. Later that month, Francisco's forces were approaching Madrid from the west and south. The Republic's government evacuated from Madrid to Valencia because they expected the capital to fall. Instead, Madrid would involve the most intense fighting of the Civil War. Forces from every single faction in the Republic, CNT, FAI, PUM, PCE, PSOE, and UGT, every single one of them answered Madrid's call for reinforcements. The Communist International formed a legion of soldiers from foreign volunteers called the International Brigades, and they sent that to Madrid. Everyone from everywhere would be involved in the siege of Madrid. With Madrid under siege, the Republic's leader, Francisco Caballero, what a name. Sorry, Caballero is basically like cowboy. Um, sorry, hoped to defend it through military alliances and diplomatic legitimacy. Throughout October and November, the Republic extended its hand to the CNT and offered them positions in government. This directly contradicted the CNT-FAI's principles against participating in government and flew in the face of what the FAI had been built for. It opened up huge controversy and debate. On one side of the aisle, the anarchists had spent the last 5 months carrying out a revolution, and entering the state was considered to be the abandonment of that revolution. On the other hand, some argued that joining the Republic was an emergency response with the incoming siege of the capital, and that whether anarchists like it or not, that the power rested with the government and Soviet aid. They believed that by joining the government, they might be able to moderate the repression. 4 anarchists ended up joining the Republic. Federica Montseny became the Minister of Health and Social Assistance, and she'd be the first woman to serve as a minister in Spain. Juan Garcia Olivier from Los Solidarios joined and became the Minister of Justice. I don't know how to... Joan, I guess in Spanish? I'm going to call her Joan. I'm not sure. Joan Peiro became the Minister of Industry, and Juan López Sánchez became the Minister of Commerce. Durruti feared that militarizing, like the Republic and PCE were pushing for, would rip apart the revolution they'd built at the seams. For him, Aragon was a living example of dual power and social transformation, so leaving felt like abandoning a good strategy and condemning the revolution to death. His column gave their blood, sweat, and tears defending it from Franco. Durruti didn't prioritize Madrid. His column agreed on Zaragoza because taking it would have split the nationalist zone in 2. When Madrid came under siege, Durruti and his column finally agreed to divert to Madrid. He went as the Delgado of the Durruti column and refused to endorse or submit to the PCE or militarize into the Popular Army. Throughout his time in Madrid, he gave speeches defending the revolution and warning not to abandon everything the people had gained since July. At the same time, he also knew if Madrid fell that it would destroy the revolution. On the 13th of November, 1936, Durruti was deployed in the University City sector, and the fighting there was close range and brutal. Franco's forces were attempting to break into the capital through Casa de Camp and across the Manzanares. During his arrival, this photo was taken, and it would be the last ever taken of him while he was alive. Durruti had left his command post to inspect positions in the sector and assess the fighting. He was leaning near a staff car, speaking to his comrades, looking over the front, when he was hit in the chest by a bullet. He died the next day at 40 years old, having survived the night, and became a legend imprinted into anarchist history. A few theories exist on who killed Buenaventura Durruti. Witnesses said enemy fire had been coming across the Manzanares toward him, and he was hit. CNT archivists will tell you the shot came from close range and was the result of a comrade's submachine gun being faulty. It was a known issue for the weapon. Still others to this day insist he was assassinated by the PCE or Soviets because the CNT-FAI represented the largest power base outside of Stalinism. And I'm sure the argument gives historians something to do with their time.
Yes, in fact,
Durruti's body
yes, it
was sent.
does.
Durruti's body was sent back to Barcelona on November 23rd. His funeral procession became the largest anarchist funeral since Kropotkin's death 20 years earlier. Hundreds of thousands of mourners attended, making it one of the largest our movement has ever recorded. The symbolism mattered even more. Durruti represented the Spanish Revolution and anarchism in Spain. His death came at a moment when the Republican zone was shifting into PCE influence. More than anything, the mourning in attendance during Durruti's funeral was a massive demonstration of anarchist strength in Spain, which gave the CNT-FAI legitimacy inside the Republic. The black and red flag of the CNT dominated the procession, and the Republic would start clamoring for favor from the anarchists. One month later, George Orwell, known for writing the book 1984, would travel to Barcelona, intending to report on the Civil War and the Revolution. He'd find himself joining POUM and was sent to the Aragon front where Durruti had been. He'd fight there for several months before later witnessing Republican repression and leaving Spain. He'd later write another book called Homage to Catalonia that everyone should read. This photo was taken as POUM stood in Barcelona at the beginning of May. On April 19th, 1937, Francisco Franco forcibly merged Carlists, Falangists, and Johns into the Spanish phalanx of the Councils of the National Syndicalist Offensive, or Fet y de los Jones, through the Unification Decree, creating a one-party state comprised of fascists, monarchists, conservatives, Catholics, and the military to stand against the Republic. To stand against the Republic was tearing itself apart in a mad grab for power, unity, and control. They could have shortened the name. In May 1937, the Republican coalition had broken down, and neither the socialists, liberals, anarchists, no, well, and neither the socialists, liberals, nor anarchists trusted each other anymore. Don?
I just want to throw it out there. We've been working on this for 2 days, but we've been working on it nonstop.
Yep.
So there's definitely some errors in here. Sorry about that, guys. The historical accuracy is right, though.
Yeah, indeed. In May 1937, the Republican coalition had broken down, and neither the socialists, liberals, nor anarchists trusted each other anymore. The Republican zones conflicts centered on who controlled Catalonia. The revolutionaries of the CNT-FAI and POUM, or the Reconstituted Republic, the PSOE, UGT, and PCE. On May 3rd, police forces under the Catalan government, loyal to the Republic, tried to seize the Barcelona telephone exchange, which had been under CNT control since the war began. Whoever controlled it could monitor or interrupt communications across the city and beyond. CNT workers resisted, shots were fired, and the barricades rose again in Barcelona's streets. For nearly 5 days, Barcelona descended into a civil war within a civil war. Around 500 were killed and 1,000 injured. On the 5th day, the CNT agreed to stand down rather than risk the Catalonian civil war exploding across the anti-fascist camp of Spain. Government reinforcements arrived from Valencia, and in the weeks that followed, the POUM was outlawed and accused of being Trotskyists and fascist collaborators once again, and its leaders were arrested. And later, Andreu Nin, POUM's founder, was kidnapped and killed by Soviet NKVD agents near Madrid. For POUM, the Barcelona May days would be existential. From this moment forward, the PCE would start to dominate the politics in the Republican zone for the rest of the Civil War. May days eliminated POUM, which strengthened the PCE's hold over the Republic even more. Control of order in Barcelona jumped from the hands of CNT patrols to government security forces, and the militarization began. The anarchist militias, including the Durruti column, which had been autonomous since July 1936, were absorbed into the popular army, just like the PCE wanted. Elected officials of the columns were either replaced by PCE political parties or willingly subordinated to the Republic. Worker collectivizations were halted by state regulations. In Aragon, collectives like the Aragon Regional Defense Council were outright dissolved by Republican forces. Anarchists themselves were disarmed, sidelined, and arrested. In January 1938, Franco had finally turned his nationalist coalition and military coup into a functioning, semi-monarchical, single-party state built on authoritarianism. He'd built a working cabinet and subordinated occupied territories to his military's control. In April, the nationalist army had made their way all the way to the Mediterranean and split the republic in half, as Durruti had intended to do to him. In July, exactly 2 years after the war began, the republic launched its last major offensive, the Battle of Ebro. The fighting went on for months, but the republic lost in the end, and their military capacity was shattered. They had nothing left to fight with. Things would continue going south with loss after loss until January 26, 1939. Catalonia, which was no longer revolutionary anyway, had fallen to Franco's forces. The Republic's Prime Minister, Juan Negrin, wanted to continue fighting, but opposition to him started a coup in Madrid led by Colonel Segismundo Casado. Casado tried to negotiate with Franco, who promptly told him to surrender unconditionally. One month later, on March 28th, Madrid finally fell to Franco, too, after having been under a siege for almost 3 years. The Republic surrendered, and with that, the Spanish Civil War, and with it, the Spanish Revolution, had ended. Franco declared himself victorious, and that the Spanish Civil War was over. Spain was now ruled by a dictator, leading a single-party government. Leftist ideologies and organizations were suppressed, thus ending Spain's strained pluralism. The economy fell under control of corporatists, figures comparable to Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos. His regime embraced monarchist and paramilitary symbolism, and censored, or killed, every enemy he had. Rather than a reactionary mass party, like Mussolini or Hitler, Franco defined his regime through the military and religion. He sidelined Hitler and Mussolini-style fascists under his reign. This actually allowed his regime to maintain legitimacy after the Axis powers fell in 1945. Before we move on to this sort of unhappy epilogue of the war, does anyone have any questions about what we've already discussed? We'll give people time to type. All right. Moving on. Fate of the Spanish anarchists. Oh, here we go. What were some of the CNT-FAI's biggest mistakes in the war, do you think? So that's actually something we're going to discuss in the forum. So at every time we do one of these lessons, we end with a forum where we ask discussion questions and the group turns their microphones on and we all talk about it. And that is absolutely one of the things that we are going to talk about because it's a hefty, hefty topic. So we'll go ahead and put a pin in that until then, but that is a very good question. With the Republic and the CNT gone, hundreds of thousands of Republican and anarchist fighters, as well as civilians, fled north in what became known as La Retirada. They crossed Catalonia into France during the winter of 1939, hoping for refuge. Instead, the French government disarmed and incarcerated them in camps such as, Argela-sur-Mer and Gurs. I can't speak French. They faced exposure, disease, inadequate shelter, and hunger. Some internees were later conscripted into labor battalions or transferred into foreign worker companies. Germany invaded France in 1940, and circumstances for refugees from Spain got even worse. Spanish anti-fascists, including anarchists, were arrested by the Nazis or handed over by Vichy authorities. Thousands were deported to concentration camps, most notably Mauthausen in Austria. Spanish Republicans formed one of the largest foreign prisoner groups there, and a majority died of starvation, forced labor, and outright executions. Mauthausen is considered one of the largest concentration camps outside of Poland. Prisoners were dehumanized and brutalized. Even though I chose not to have a trauma fest by posting the worst images, prisoners were photographed having been killed, hanging in the fence while trying to escape. Those prisoners would be left there for days. They were photographed naked and emaciated, standing in groups to be inspected by Nazis. Mauthausen, or Auschwitz, or Jasenovac, Mauthausen wasn't Auschwitz or Jasenovac, but it was still a brutal camp. 190,000 prisoners would pass through Mauthausen. Of those prisoners, around 90,000 to 120,000 people would be killed from 1938 to 1935. 45, sorry. Of those, it's estimated that tens of thousands of communists were killed. Around 5,000 Spanish Republicans were also killed. It was built by the prisoners from Dachau, the first Nazi concentration camp. And the big demographics were Allied soldiers from the Soviet Union, Spanish anarchists and communists, and the rest were anti-fascist resistance fighters like members of the French Marquis. If you personally irritated Hitler, Franco, or Mussolini, then Mauthausen was where you were sent. It wasn't all despair, though. Loads of Spanish exiles joined the French partisan resistance. Anarchists were all over France, fighting back through the Maquis guerrilla networks, and were directly involved in the liberation of southern France. Spanish anarchists and communists were part of Operation Dragoon on August 15, 1944. They were the internal resistance that units like the British SAS needed to soften Nazi forces for their campaign. Afterwards, they were mostly forgotten or collapsed into French Maquis resistance, but they were there. And if you look them up, there's some sick photos of people doing some of these training operations to observe. I had a good time doing research for this.
Get a good look at this guy's face before we move on.
Yeah. I mean, he's got a gun pointing right at his face. Anyway, back in Spain, tens of thousands of CNT militants were imprisoned, executed, or subjugated to forced labor. The anarchist movement was driven underground and would stay there for about 30 years. Francisco Franco died in 1975. With it, his regime, Spain, I'll start that over. Francisco Franco died in 1975. With it, his regime. Spain reformed into another constitutional monarchy within 2 years under King Juan Carlos I. The CNT began to reappear immediately in 1975. By 1977, they were a fully public anarcho-syndicalist union once again. But the FAI had died with Olivier's parliamentarianism and Durruty's death. The remergent union had a factional split. One wanted to maintain strict anarcho-syndicalist principles. That current became what's known as the CNT-AIT, often just called the CNT in Spain. And the other argued for participation in state-recognized union elections and workplace representation structures created during the democratic transition. They believed refusing those mechanisms would marginalize the union. That faction split and formed the CGT in the 1980s. In 2026, both still exist. Both are active. And in Spain, it's not uncommon for anarchists to organize publicly because the new monarchy doesn't prosecute them like Franco did. None of it was pretty, but the Spanish anarchists did survive. Forum time. I will be right back, Tom, if you can lead the discussion.
If I could get my stuff to stop glitching. There we go. All right. So, we've talked about a lot, and I've also had to crunch a lot for this episode. But what are your guys' takeaways from the Spanish Civil War? Anyone?
I've got an opinion. I always see reflections of other events in big wars like this. Like, I mean, obviously hindsight's 2020, right? Like, when you're in a war situation, there's so many factors at play that it's really hard to like think. That's why logistics are so important. Things like food and water, perhaps having support from local populations, are really, really, really important for having successful things go on. Because if all you can do is like pillage and steal, eventually you're going to run out of stuff to deal with. But it really seems like the same question of like state legitimacy and majority power and support from larger like factions continued to be something that happened over and over again in this conflict. Um, a major theme I noticed reading through this was like decisions made based on how much people trusted the abilities of the general populace of like a village or a city to be able to make wise choices about their own like revolution. And I guess if we also think about, last time we discussed the theory of anarcho-syndicalism, I feel like it proved to be very effective for creating the sorts of structures that could click into place to meet this response that happened when the Civil War broke out. If that hadn't been there, I think it would have gone much, much faster. And there wouldn't have been much resistance, I think. So I could be wrong. Maybe it would just all be Stalinists and instead of a bunch of anarchists that were already ready to defend their homeland.
Something I noticed is that, like, I compare the Spanish anarchists to the like very strong Marxist movement in Germany, and how like there was a lot of collaboration there, both from social democrats and from more hardcore communists, because they viewed the other side as the biggest threat. It is interesting to me that there is such a split with the anarchists, where Germany folded very quickly, and anarchists and Spain generally fought fascism for about 3 years in a very long and hard fought battle.
Go ahead, Eden.
Can you all hear me all right?
Yep.
Okay. I think for me, a really interesting part of the Spanish Civil War, and something I see as a direct line to other revolutionary struggles, like the one in Rojava, is that the anarchists didn't consolidate their gains and kind of tried to play sort of not both sides, but like try to like maintain their ethics and ideological integrity. Is my microphone fucked? I'm getting a note on my...
We can hear you just fine. There's a slight echo, but it's not that distracting.
Okay, I'm just gonna see if I can ditch my little earbuds here and make this. Can everybody hear me now?
Yeah, that's much better actually.
Okay, so I think that like both, the thing that really weakened the anarchists and really also weakened the SDF was trying to sort of get involved in the larger political games that were happening. Yep. And being used for strategies that didn't necessarily benefit them. So the anarchists, instead of consolidating their gains and really like focusing on defending their communities, continued to advance. And I feel like that, and that was like in collaboration with the communists, right? Who wanted to kind of use them and overextend them. And I think that's kind of maybe a lesson to be more like, not be the foot soldiers of other people's maybe less well-intentioned motivations, whether you're like doing the footwork of a nonprofit somewhere or like that sort of thing. I think that it's really easy to, if your ideology
is really based on assuming the best in people and working together with people. You get like caught in that sometimes without a good overall analysis, and you can overextend yourself.
Yeah.
And that's I think an interesting parallel to draw from this specific, like fairly successful revolution with examples of other ones as well.
Plus, there's a really interesting strategic. I'll read what Zalant wrote real quick. I think the attempts to create legitimacy by participating in pre-existing institutions was a mistake. It buys into the myth-making of those institutions that they are the only legitimate avenues for anything. And yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. That like it seemed that the whole point of anarchism, or at least of the anarchism that I see practiced in the Spanish Civil War, is to sort of show people how ridiculous the concept of the legitimacy of these organizations is. That when you centralize and like start to pass all these things, instead of letting the people who live in the village in the hills who do this one particular type of thing lead themselves, because they know the hills, they know their industries, they know what they have and what they don't have, it makes more sense to let them do things on their own. But I think it's, for me, the biggest theme is that war is hell, right? You're fighting, you're starving, you're marching and marching and marching, and just like constant chaos followed by silence and then chaos again. It's so easy to lose your way. That's really the tricky part for me, is the logistics of how do you maintain that dogma? Not dogma, but
For me, the way the PCE and Stalinists seized power over the Republic and then they pressured the CNT until it broke shows me that a communist party is really just incompatible with anarchism. Now, you've got examples like POOM, but we already established that POOM wasn't a regular communist party. They were a whole different shenanigan. When communists always try to get anarchists to subordinate to them, and when they can't get us to, they normally assassinate us, repress us, slander us, and make baseless accusations against us, like they did against POOM.
although, I kind of wonder, and I'm not disagreeing with you, but I'm just saying, for the sake of thinking about the twists and turns of history, I wonder how different communism would be if Stalin hadn't meddled so intensely in communist parties all over the entire world, which was a huge part of the first half of the 20th century. Basically, leftist like alliances all over the world changed extremely significantly when suddenly communists everywhere who were loyal to the Soviet Union started doing what the Soviet Union said instead of doing whatever their alliances said, and everything changed instantly. Now, I don't want to be an apologist. I think that there are some definite problems with the communist theory of doing things, but it also wasn't really given its chance to like develop its own ideas before some guy decided to, wag himself into things.
Yeah, I tend to agree. Generally, it seems like as long as communists don't have a leader they rally around, they're either agreeable or are too busy shooting themselves in the foot to be any sort of threat.
To me, the irritating thing about a lots of the decisions that more communist organizations in the Spanish Civil War were making is they kept saying, oh, well, we're going to do the revolution later. So let's do this one thing now so that we can get the power, and then we'll do a revolution later once we get the power. And it just seems so blindsided to me. Like, what are you like? I feel like the anarchists were definitely right in that situation, that like the war is the revolution. Like, there is no waiting. There's this weird unnecessary bureaucracy to it that seems just completely superfluous. I think we're pretty much good to move on to the next slide, though, because we're kind of blending topics. Yeah. I'm just going to start by drawing a relationship to another lesson that we did weeks and weeks ago. There was a week when Dom was not available to do the wonderful, wonderful research that he normally does. So I did some research and did a little lesson on the 1848 revolution in France. And I don't remember all of it right now, but something that did happen, they created their own little fancy republic that didn't do super well. And in that fancy republic, a bunch of bright-eyed leftists, including Proudhon, who was kind of a anarchist forefather participant, There are many arguments about the origins of anarchism, and I don't really know enough about that. But he's part of the early parts of the development of the theories that we hold now. Joined this government. He was in the government. And the thing he talks about is that like being in the government feels like being so distant from everything that's going on. You have no idea what's going on in the streets. He didn't know what was going on in the barricades. I just want to draw that relationship right up front because I kept thinking about it.
I think that the CNT and POOM had enough of their own power base that they were representing dual power in Catalonia. The Republic absorbed and then crushed the CNT, followed immediately by Franco crushing everyone else and ruling until they died of old age. I think things would have gone very differently if instead of responding to Madrid, Durruti would have focused on Zaragoza. And I also think that Olivier joining the Republic had massive consequences given his symbolic weight from the from Los Solidarios. Anyone else?
I'll just say up front, I feel like Ian touched on something extremely important. That's like if they had continued to just focus on creating these federated systems of liberated like villages and cities, that once they're liberated, they start to kind of collectivize and do their own fucking thing and build their own systems and work together. If they had just kept on doing that, or rather, if circumstances had allowed them to keep on doing that, then there wouldn't have been a centralized force to so easily destroy. But you know, hindsight, it's logistics are so important for these kinds of things, and it's also hard to make strategic choices when you're watching people die and you're thinking about like, well, whether I go here or here is human lives, and that makes it really hard to make those kinds of choices. But I'm interested in what everybody else might think. This is such a complicated topic.
Testing. Can anyone hear me?
Yep.
I think they're like it seems to me like they kind of consistently lacked good intelligence about what their allies wanted with them, and that's why they kept cooperating with them. I think better intelligence gathering probably would have helped them quite a bit.
I think the push towards the popular.
And that's a point that I've seen people raise. Oh, was someone else about to? Oh, that's.
I was just gonna say that a lot of that comes down to the Popular Front and this whole idea of leftist unity. The Stalin's regime was the first one to really seriously start pushing it, and in doing so, it basically created a section of anarchists who didn't realize that the communists weren't just somebody with a different idea about revolution. For one to gain power over the other kind of has to take over the opposing faction. If anarchists come into power, it's usually fighting against the communists. And this happens in so many ways across time and history. It happened in Ukraine, it happened in Spain, it happened in Mexico even, during the Mexican Revolution. there's this common theme of the propaganda reaching the anarchists and kind of making us put our guard down.
Yeah.
I think the more modern version of that is don't COINTELPRO yourself, which is something I've seen, especially from authoritarian leftists.
Yeah. Yeah, fucking Hoover, bastard. What a devious. It's such a brilliant strategy to destroy unity that it works whether they're doing it or not. It's just this thing that's never going to leave. Yikes. I mean, and like this is something I've heard people say before, per what Dom was saying, is that like anarchism in general is very. I'm trying to think of how to say this that won't be. This might be the wrong way to phrase this, but anarchism is very idealist. You know, it's about believing that you can, like somebody said earlier, like believing that you can trust people and that people intend the best, and that you liberate this village, you free them, and then you just kind of do their thing. Like it's more complicated than that, obviously, but there's this argument to be said for the kinds of people that are so fixated on bureaucracy and less on kind of getting their sleeves and their boots a little dirty and doing stuff, that they're going to be having their eyes on the big picture a lot more, moving pieces around. And it's not that that's better, but that it allows the people that are making those sorts of large scale bureaucratic choices, like the big communist unified parties and stuff, to be able to make big strategic decisions at certain points that allow them to shift the power balance. Whereas anarchists are, I think, genuinely already believe in leftist unity to a certain degree. Not to the degree that Stalin intended, but
Daniel, you've been awfully quiet. I'm curious about your opinion on what we could have done differently during the Spanish Civil War. I guess not tonight. Moving on.
Oh, I had myself muted.
Oh, thanks. You can say it again.
All what I was saying was there's this event that Bookchin talks about, and I don't remember which piece he's talking about it, but there's a point where the CNT-FAI claims a very large portion of territory, and essentially the previous governor of the area that they're in comes to them and he says, okay, well, you won fair and square. I was your enemy, but I cede the territory. You all get to decide what you're going to do now. You need to decide whether you're going to be a completely autonomous structure that does not fall under the rules and laws of the Spanish Republic, or whether you are you don't claim territory, you don't claim power. And I think probably what was maybe the worst decision of the entire revolution, they said that we don't claim power because if we claimed power, that would be like making a state. Basically, that was the conclusion that the delegation of people that made the decision decided. I think that's utterly foolish. I think that was a complete misunderstanding of the anarchist praxis, and that they should have essentially claimed an autonomous territory where the Republic had no reach and had no sovereignty in that area. That should have been their approach, and I think that was a big mistake, was collaborating with the Republic too much, and it's one of many examples.
Daniel, isn't there's a term there's a lot of terms for like different types of rhetorical arguments in bad faith, and there's one for saying like the way that you were framing it, that he's saying, well, you can either do this or that, and like no, you could do a lot of things, but what's the term for that? Like framing.
It's called the false dichotomy.
Yeah, it's a false dichotomy. Like, who was the one presenting that? Was it this fucking general, or was it the party itself, or someone in their alliance with the Republic?
I do not recall. I'm trying to figure out, like, last time I heard about it, what the source was for this. Bookchin
Sure.
talks about it, but then I also heard there was a YouTube channel I watched. It was one of the anarchist YouTube channels.
You can
It's
post
not
it if you
Crime
want.
Think. There's no way I'm going to be able to find it in a crunch.
That's all right.
But yeah, I mean, yeah, I suppose it was a false dichotomy, but I think that they could have easily just chosen, to be autonomous. They should have just in the dichotomy, it was fine. There was a good answer. They just
Yeah.
chose the wrong one, in my opinion.
Yep. Yeah, that's really tragic. There's something to be said for that conversation between idealism and I'm going to read what Zalant said. They said, I like to think of a false dichotomy as a heads I win, tails you lose thing. It highlights the dishonesty. And this also sounds like the sort of thing that happens when people discuss something for way too long. Like if you've ever been in a meeting to plan something, whether it's an action that's really serious or just like a book fair or like a bake sale or something really small, and like you get stuck on something really small, like the size of the tables that you use, or like where we're going to park the cars for like the people that are arriving for this action that we're doing. And it goes on and on and on. And the longer you go, the more the argument starts to shift and opinion starts to shift, and everyone loses track of exactly what they were talking about. I think this happens a lot in sort of drawn out meeting type discussions that happen in leftist spaces, probably other spaces too. But I don't have a solution to that necessarily. I think it's just a human problem. But yeah, that first bit is called bike shedding. Which bit? Sorry.
The bit where you don't discuss anything like really important, you discuss something small.
Oh God.
I think the psychology behind it is that big important decisions will have big ramifications that are difficult to think about. So it's just kind of cognitively easier to focus on something a lot smaller. Like I think it's like the color of the bike shed is like the example that the name comes from.
Yeah. There's also this thing that like when you build an organization off of ideals and idealism and like a system and a philosophy, you tend to be so like I feel like people tend to get very fixated on making sure that every aspect of their decision making conforms to these ideals that they're trying to stick to. And in general, I think anarchism is pretty anti that. I've seen a lot of really good literature from people who happen to be anarchists talking about trying to avoid doing that. But it does happen when people spend a lot of time thinking about ideas and implementing them.
Bell Hooks talks about that in, I think, Feminism from Margin to Center. And she talks about how like being, in this case, a feminist becomes like an identity statement. And that's why it can be so difficult to get people to get on board with it, because they think that like you have to be a certain kind of person to be a feminist. And so she advocates for changing the name from like changing a language. Instead of saying I am a feminist, you say like I support feminism, or I believe that feminism is a good idea.
Oh,
that takes it out of the realms of identity and into the realms of like a practical thing that has like stuff you can discuss about it.
Time is a flat circle. I think we're ready for the next question.
By the way, not to interrupt, but I found the video. It was on Submedia. I'll just link it here. I don't know if we want to interrupt to do that, but
no, please go ahead.
I even found the timestamp where it's being discussed.
Rad.
Timestamp around 4:06. It looks like.
So grab that before I forget. But it's going to start playing. Well, we'll see what happens with that.
So
right. I can't answer this because I put this together. So thanks for your comments, Ian. I really appreciated you coming. I hope you come back Well, next week is actually Daniel here leads a discussion reading group about a book. They're working through a particular text right now, but and then the week after that, Dom and I are coming back with who knows what. I don't know. But what did everybody think of the lesson and the story? These past two lessons, Dom and I have been trying a new way of doing things, splitting it up between one lesson about the theory and then one lesson examining the history. And then this lesson, we're switching from having the script in the slides to having a separate script and more sort of additional auxiliary things in the slides. Would love to hear what people think about this and just generally takeaways from the whole story that we told here. Just anything.
I mean, I think the one thing you needed was more time to work on this. 2 days of crunch was
good
not
God,
enough,
yeah.
and also I don't think very sustainable.
And like
No.
he got kicked out of his apartment, and so suddenly we had to like move a bunch of stuff and find a cat sitter. Just very distracted.
Yeah, it was definitely rough trying to throw this together. I mean, we had a frame, and I already knew how the Spanish Civil War went, but still, all of the time trying to translate that into a script and to a good presentation was hard.
Yeah, we got better every time though. We're starting to find a streamlined format that's really working for us.
Now I just gotta remember where I put things. That at the very beginning, when I stopped talking, I had looked for that repetition because I knew I'd stuck that paragraph somewhere,
Yeah,
and then I couldn't find it when I went back for it.
I'll say because I'm kind of in terms of the dynamic that Dom and I have. I'm kind of the podcast idiot in terms of things. I don't know that much about history. I'm still learning a lot of theory. So like I tend to be learning the topics alongside people. I knew generally about the Spanish Civil War, but this is my first time really diving in. It is just incredible how many times I see certain themes rhyming throughout history and then other ones appearing for the first time. It seems like we keep having to answer the same questions as leftists every time the forces of the world come together such that there is a major political event wherein anarchism is called into question or any sort of horizontal political organization. I feel like we always keep running into the same questions of like legitimacy, majority, participation, how to manage infighting. And I hope that we find better answers for those the next time that wheel turns around.
I think a lot of it is that, generally speaking, most anarchists are in areas where there isn't a lot of anarchist organizing efforts. So all institutional knowledge has to basically be created mostly from scratch when dealing with a horizontalist organization. There isn't really that like collective memory there.
Like how Octopi don't teach their kids anything. Maybe that was a wild metaphor, but if anyone didn't know that, octopi are super intelligent, and people talk about that all the time. But one thing they don't do is they don't teach their kids. Their kids start out from scratch. So I guess someone should try to make octopi have a school and see what they do with that. Maybe something fascinating. Does anyone else have anything else in terms of reflections on the lesson itself? All right, next slide, Dom.
Plug the pluggables. So, next popular education. I'm probably thinking we're gonna have to break into Marx, and we're gonna do this from the anarchist perspective. I've read Das Kapital front to back, and it is such a slog. And I got the biggest trick is gonna be finding out how to make it fun, but I also think it's an important thing to describe the opposition to anarchism from the get-go and how it also kind of shaped anarchism.
good call. I also want to open up that this is a section where if anyone's got an event coming up or an org or stuff that they want people to know about, this is a good time to mention it. I always say the same thing. Myself and my husband have a creative team called Astrophoria. We operate here in Tulsa, where we are. Our website is astrophoria.org. If you want to see what we do, we've done big productions. We've done zines that ballooned into hundreds of pages. We do graphic design. We put shows on. Take a look. We've got all sorts of stuff going on. Daniel, you maybe want to give a quick second, talk about the other thing that we do on Mondays?
Yep, next week on Monday, same time slot, we'll be doing organizer education, continuing our reading of Full Spectrum Resistance. Come join us.
And anyone else is totally free to unmute and tell us what they've got going on if you so choose.
Just as a fun little side note here, if anyone doesn't know, that would be Sergeant Schultz from the show Hogan's Heroes. It was one of the first attempts to make fun of the Nazis after the war.
Oh.
It really is a good, lighthearted show about a really dark subject.
I just think about Hulk Hogan when I hear Hogan's Heroes.
Sorry, I couldn't mute my
Sounds
mic
like
fast
everybody said
enough.
what they're going to say. So thanks everyone for coming around. Definitely check out Co-op Tulsa or Cooperation Tulsa's social media for other stuff that we do, other classes on Monday. And you can come back to this same link in 2 weeks at the same time for our next class about the theory of, I guess, Marx. That's going to be fun to put together. Oh, and this is a photo of the place where Durruti was born. Not the specific place, but the city itself.
Hell yeah. Thank you all for putting this together.
Okay, bye.